Oh, hi there, esteemed listeners of The Week Unwrapped. Thanks for stopping by. Before I start the show, I do have some exciting news for you. The Week Unwrapped is going on tour. Well, one date, actually. But it's a good one. You can see us do the podcast live at the Cheltenham Science Festival on Thursday, the 7th of June. It'll be me, Arian McNichol, Rebecca Gillie, and special guest Adam Rutherford, him off of Radio 4. And there's a special promo code for you. Just you. Go to cheltenhamfestivals.com/science and use the promo code THEWEEK for 50% off the ticket price. You are welcome. That is The Week Unwrapped live on the evening of Thursday the 7th of June at Cheltenham Science Festival, and use the offer code THEWEEK for 50% off. We'll see you on the 7th. Here's this week's show. It's the week ending Saturday the 19th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a shock victory for the opposition in Malaysia, North Korea threatening to quit peace talks, and rehearsals getting underway for the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie, Holden Frith and Kari Wilkin. And starting the show this week with a typically offbeat story, but then here's literally the boss, it's Holden. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
We now interrupt our scheduled programming for this breaking news story.
In the 2nd century AD, Rome had reached its zenith, its greatest territorial extent. It was kind of like when a roller coaster gets to the very top of a rise and is about to go down the other side. You get this glorious moment of feeling like you're on top of everything, and you're almost unaware that terror is about to start. This happened, I think, to the Romans in the 2nd century. They were sitting on top of the world and weren't aware that in the 3rd century, everything was going to come apart.
Professor Noel Lenski speaking on the documentary Barbarians Rising, The Rise and Fall of an Empire. You can find out more on History's YouTube channel. So, Holden, you've brought us a warning from history this week. In this case, the History Channel. What's it got to do with what's happening now?
There has actually been a breaking development on the fall of the Roman Empire this week. It came in the form of a research paper published on Monday, which presented pretty conclusive evidence of the link between levels of wealth in the Roman Empire and layers of ice found in the Arctic landscape.
Okay, what link?
If you drill down into this ice and get down as far as 600 metres, you can find layers of ice which provide a year-by-year accounting of the Roman economy, because the Romans used silver-based coins, and in the process of mining and smelting this silver ore, which contains traces of lead, the lead was released into the atmosphere, drifts through the air, and some of it then ends up in snowfall over the Arctic.
There you go. And you think it's just the 21st century where we've got our online accounting software and we're all so smart. Rebecca, at the risk of getting all Garnier on this, here comes the science bit. What can lead deposits really teach us about the Roman Empire?
For one thing, they mark events that we already know happened. For instance, there was a plague, it was called the Antonine Plague, and historians think that millions of people died during this. So obviously there were far fewer people left than using coins, so they didn't need to make as many.
So that's visible in the deposit?
Yeah, so we can see that. And then at times of expansion and the development of new Roman colonies, there was an increase in lead deposits as more silver coins are being distributed among these new territories. But also, it just shows us things that we didn't necessarily know, like year-to-year oscillations, which, I think before this, if you'd asked me, and I think if you'd asked most people, you'd have thought it's not possible. We're never going to be able to reconstruct this minute economic history of Rome. But we can. In total, they took around 21,000 readings of lead deposit levels. They have tried to use this technology before, this drilling technology, but they only got about a dozen data points. So it didn't really tell us anything in detail. This lets us reconstruct Roman life in a way that I think few people would have thought was possible.
Okay, and is that your point, Holden, with bringing it to the table? Because to recap the concept of the show, which you co-created, repercussions for all our lives. Right, so the repercussions are what? That in the future, historical archaeology is going to come into play when trying to work out economic patterns?
Partly that. I think that's probably my excuse for bringing it in. Because it will...
I'm trying to help you here.
It does give historians, economists, climate scientists this sort of vast trove of data that will help in their efforts to understand how the world works, and that is significant. But I think really what appealed about it to me is I just find it immensely reassuring for some reason that all of these huge world events, wars, plagues, rise and fall of an empire, end up as the deposits of minute quantities of elements in the Arctic landscape. And I think the kind of change...
That sounds like the most chilling existential thought in the world.
I agree
Holden
that
is reassured.
Some people will look at that and see it in a kind of apocalyptic frame of mind, or even that the Roman Empire fell in this sort of disastrous way, and perhaps the same thing will happen to us. And I think I look at it with that in mind, but just seeing it through this kind of remote perspective. It's almost like, I know I've referred to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy on this podcast before, but to do so again, it's like the moment when Arthur Dent looks up the entry for Earth and finds that it just says mostly harmless. And that, in fact, is a revised and extended version of the previous edition where it just said harmless. And then you get that kind of massive switch of perspective, which makes all of the kind of daily travails and Twitter spats and news stories just feel slightly less urgent.
Kari.
On the other hand, does it not have a slightly more optimistic spin in that, we've now got a much better understanding of this period that spans almost 2,000 years, and it gives us the wider perspective, the more distant perspective, and there's that famous saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We've got that distance. Can we not use this hopefully as a learning experience
What
to
did you
see
learn,
those
Kari?
mistakes?
What did you learn?
Boom and bust is bad.
And maybe Boom and Bust has always been. I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it?
It's just the patterns that we keep repeating over and over again, and perhaps sort of getting this view of such a large timescale and such a powerful empire. Maybe we can actually learn something from that. We don't have that sort of personal attachment, whatever you want to say, that we have to more recent history. You can be a bit more objective about it.
And just briefly on this before we move on, it reminds me that, Rebecca, a few weeks ago, when the mics were off, we have spontaneous and exciting gossipy conversations here at the Week on Rap when the mics are off. We were chatting spontaneously about the use of lead in petrol and what that did to society. Do you remember what you were saying for the benefit of... Now the mics are on for the benefit of our audience.
Yeah, I think we've actually talked about this in the office before. There's a theory that...
That's for the benefit of people listening in the office. Oh, yeah, you'll remember this one.
There's a popular theory that basically in the rise of the car in the 1940s and 50s, and everyone in the US had cars, then there was this massive spike in violent crime in the 70s, and they think it's because the people who are growing up in the 1950s were inhaling loads and loads of lead fumes, which kind of like poison their brain, and that's why we had so many creepy, weird serial killers, as well as all the other violent crime.
There's actually quite good evidence. It's called the lead crime hypothesis, and the reason there is quite good evidence for it is that different US states banned lead in petrol at different times, and you can track quite a lot of the reduction in crime from the mid-90s onwards to the period when children who would have been exposed to that reached the sort of 16 to 25 age group where most crime is committed. The biggest study it was a meta-study of a lot of individual studies, concluded that 56% of the reduction in crime from the mid-90s onwards was down to eliminating lead from petrol. Because lead is known to reduce IQ, increase aggression, and reduce impulse control, so that you can see how that combination could quite easily lead to violence.
And lead to the building of St Albans? I mean, might the Romans have done less raping and pillaging and more civilisationing if they hadn't had lead currency, Kari?
But would they have been as successful? Because that got them where they were, didn't it?
Would they have left us such nice amphitheatres?
Exactly.
Well, I thought that was a track worth re-exploring. Right, Rebecca, you are next this week. What would you like to bring to the table?
The latest retro throwback, noblesse oblige.
So, it's the Navy.
Well, there's a bit more to it than that, sir.
Oh, you want me to say you talked to somebody else?
Yes, I did, sir. With Mother. She said, "You're not a bird, and you're not a fish. If your engine stops, you crash. If your ship sunk, you're sunk too. A man's made to live on the ground. It's safer." She shouldn't have said that. I don't want to be safer than anybody else.
But what have you decided?
I'm going into the Fleet Air Arm, sir.
You've got the right idea.
Right, well, from the Roman Empire, we've come bang up to date to the 1942 propaganda film The Volunteer. Ralph Richardson and Auntie Asquith, you were hearing there. You can watch the whole thing for free on the BFI player. Rebecca, what tenuous link can you make from this forgotten movie to an unreported story from this week?
Well, the theme is volunteerism. In this case, volunteering to give more of your money to the council to pay for services. This is something that Islington Council is now talking about implementing. Westminster Council already did this, which is us basically targeting the wealthiest residents, or rather the residents who live in high band council tax properties, and asking them to volunteer to pay a supplement to their council tax.
OK, Kari, what do we think of this in principle? Charging seemingly more wealthy people because they live in bigger, more expensive homes, more council tax if they're willing to pay it?
I think in principle, just on a sort of very abstract level, it sounds fair. On the other hand, surely you can argue that if our taxes are being used properly, they wouldn't need to be asking for more money. I think there's also problems with the current way that the tax band, there's so much variation between property values within each tax band. I think that needs to be reworked. So I understand the reasoning behind it, but isn't it just another symptom of the fact that the system is broken?
Yeah, exactly. And the council tax banding that we use now is based on property values from 1991.
Yeah, what's that about, by the way?
Well, I mean, on one hand, it sort of works in a macro sense in that if you lived in a big fancy house in 1991,
it's still worth a lot of money.
Yes,
sure.
But
why haven't they updated it since 1991? I've never understood that.
The problem is more that the gap between the most expensive properties and the cheap properties has got wider and wider.
Yeah.
It's just it would be politically painful to do. So
to value houses?
Yeah, because some
I can do it.
no, it's more that
pushing more people into the more expensive band, you're not going to be popular, are you?
Yeah, and some people will benefit and some will lose out. But the people who lose out will shout much louder than the people who benefit. So it's always just been seen as a losing proposition.
I mean, it's repeatedly been discussed, hasn't it? And governments always just sort of shove it under the carpet.
I mean, it's a side issue, but it is just absurd now, isn't it, that it's so long ago?
Yeah.
I mean, like 20 years ago, you could sort of say, it's a bit weird that it's still 1991 that we're using. Now it's just unacceptable, isn't it?
And that's why Islington is resorting to this kind of circuitous route to try and, make up the imbalance. And obviously, local councils have been suffering from a dearth of funding, and services have been closed down. And so one argument would be, well, it's better to go in this slightly odd circuitous direction to kind of redress the wealth imbalance and keep vital services open. But then the counter argument to that obviously is you've got the right wing argument, if you will, which is why should I pay more when I'm already paying my fair share? And then you've got the left wing argument, which is surely this is just providing an excuse, for the Tory central government to continue to defund.
Well, and that's why
councils.
To take the examples of Islington and Westminster, that's why it's quite interesting, isn't it, within London? I mean, for listeners around the world who don't know, Islington is very much sort of Labour heartland, is where Jeremy Corbyn's an MP. They're a Labour council. Westminster is a Tory-led council, isn't it? But they've both implemented this voluntary tax idea, which suggests it's not actually a left-right divide. It's just something you have to do to get some more money.
Well, we might see a left-right divide on the uptake. When they implemented this in Westminster, only 2% of the eligible households actually agreed to pay the supplement. It'll be interesting to see what the uptake is like, as you say, in lefty, liberal, Corbyn land, Islington.
It certainly hasn't been very successful in other countries. In Norway, which is quite a liberal country, they tried to introduce a similar voluntary tax scheme last June, and within the first month, and Norway's a rich country, and within the first month it raised less than £1,000.
Might it be because if you're rich enough to be able to make charitable donations and all the rest of it, then if you're inclined that way and it's voluntary, you already are doing that?
That's the thing. The FT reported in December that since 2000, just 200 payments of voluntary tax have been made in the UK, which totalled 8.3 million. By comparison, about 10 billion a year is given to charity. So yeah, people are going to argue, why should I be doing this when I'm giving to charity, which is going to be funneled straight into the needy causes?
I think that's the thing, that some people clearly are willing to give charitably, but their local authority is probably going to be quite a long way down the list of priorities. And one of the reasons that I feel a bit uneasy about it is that I think it invites a situation where people sort of selectively choosing government services to fund. So you might end up with the NHS, for example, being a relatively popular recipient of funding. And there are talks about introducing an NHS-specific tax. And you can see why politically that would be much easier than just pushing up income tax. But then, we've still got to pay for the unpopular things like prisons, for example, or perhaps some parts of social services, which are perhaps less likely to win over those sorts of voluntary contributions.
I believe the Westminster drive, they were saying the money would be used to tackle homelessness. So obviously that's not something that's going to affect the people that are actually going to be contributing this money, which may also be a factor in why there's not been much enthusiasm for it.
Yeah, and homelessness is an issue that I think it's relatively easy to get a broad consensus that homelessness is bad and that we should be, coming up with ways to try and get people, into permanent accommodation. But as Holden was saying, some things would be less popular. For instance, maybe like some drug programs, things like that, can be controversial. They're not always straightforward. And this is why we don't let people choose what public services are. The whole reason that we have a welfare state is because we know that private philanthropy doesn't work.
But you're
That's
speculating about repercussions
context.
which may happen that haven't. I mean, at the moment, you're not able to select. It's just a voluntary thing. Doesn't it actually point to the fact that there's a sort of problem with the way that tax is perceived by the general public at all? Really, if it was equated to charity, if it was saying this is you doing your bit, you're paying for schools and the NHS and you're paying for public services, people might be more inclined to pay it and not avoid it. But the whole way our tax system's set up, I mean, I've got an accountant, they tell me this is what I advise you to do so you pay as little tax as possible. That's how the whole system is set up. And even if you want to do the right thing, you're actually led down a path of trying to pay as little as possible.
But I think the problem with looking at taxes, the idea of making out that tax is some kind of gift to the state is so counterproductive because it leads to this atmosphere of, well, I'm paying for their benefits, I'm paying for immigrants to do this, I'm paying for single mums to have XYZ, whereas in more theoretically, I mean not for everyone, but on the whole, in countries, in Scandinavia, for instance, there is more of a feeling of we all pay in and we all take out, and more like a sort of a communal feeling to taxes, that it's something that we all do and we all receive the benefit. This is why the concept of noblesse oblige kind of sprang to my head, this idea that there's this wealthy aristocracy who are generously giving the poor and underprivileged a favour, and in return they expect a certain level of behaviour.
And I think it might end up like, if you go to a restaurant and somebody suggests everybody pays for what they ate, you always end up with a situation where everybody says that they've, and probably feels that they've paid more than their fair share, and yet somehow there isn't enough money in the pot. And it's actually always less painful if somebody just says, everybody stick in 55 quid and we'll be done.
And people start demanding more for their money. If you're going, like you say, you're splitting the bill, you're sort of like, well, I'll have a pudding then, I'll have an extra glass of wine.
55 quid each. Where are you going?
Obviously not the same place as Rebecca.
There was, I apologise in advance for another detour into ancient history, but the ancient Greeks had a system of sort of voluntary taxation, although it was there were various forms of encouraging compliance. So all payments were public. And if I felt that somebody who was more wealthy had paid less than me, I could challenge them, and they could either then up their payment to the state, or if they refused, I could take them to a sort of court where they would be forced to swap assets with me. So it was actually quite a progressive setup, because if they had more assets, they would obviously not want to swap with me, and so they would be obliged to pay more. And you can imagine a situation where if any company that paid more in tax than Facebook could challenge them to either pay up or swap assets with them, then Facebook might have a slightly different attitude towards taxation.
Okay, that doesn't seem the most practical replacement for council tax, though. I mean, the thing with council tax is it is all the ideals you were talking about, isn't it, Rebecca? It is about community. Like the whole point of the point of it existing at all, as separate from general taxation, is you're supposed to think, I'm helping my local community.
Yes.
Yet people don't. So what would you, blue sky thinking, what would you replace council tax with?
It depends which way you want to go, because there are lots of people who will like this idea and say, yeah, it is fair that the rich should pay more. So one route that you could go down, if that's your cup of tea, is, in America you have property taxes, which then fund local schools. The criticism of that is that obviously wealthy areas then have better schools. The most obvious solution, I would say, is to reassess council tax bands, because then you'd be putting a lot more people in higher council tax bands where they should go. The obstacle to that being that I just can't think of how any government would do it.
I think this policy, both from Westminster and Islington, probably isn't about raising revenue. I think it's actually more about making a political statement that we as councils have not got enough money, and it's sending a message to central government that we need more funding, and to voters saying, look, the reason we're cutting back services, the reason you're seeing more potholes is we're just really short of cash.
Time for Kari and your story of the week.
Are film goers fed up with the same old rom-com plots?
We know everything about them, what they like, what they don't like. We are the men behind the curtain.
Does Rick have good Yankees tickets?
No. He watches from the bleachers like a common peasant. Yeah, of course he does.
We need the people in these 2 seats to make out.
The world's our oyster!
Looking forward to see how Holden makes this about the Roman Empire. That was the trailer of the forthcoming Netflix rom-com, Set It Up. Kari, here we were all thinking the rom-com was dead.
I know, if only. No, Netflix this week released the first trailer for this new rom-com, Set It Up, which is by the same director who did The US Office. And it's got some good stars in it. It's Zoe Deutsch and Glenn Powell as a pair of overworked office assistants whose horrible bosses are just miserable. So they figure if they get them together, that will make their lives easier. And the older bosses are played by Lucy Liu and Taye Diggs. And obviously then the younger couple fall in love.
But I mean, what's your point? I mean, Netflix have a track record in delivering what people actually want to watch rather than what they say they want to watch. If you see what I mean, is that it? Is that, you know, people say they don't want rom-coms, but they do?
I think it marks a resurgence in rom-coms, although actually last week Metro had an article saying where have all the rom-coms gone? There's been a massive decline in the genre. I think 1998 rom-coms accounted for 7.4% of films released. Where was it? Now it's about 0.1%. So clearly Netflix have spotted a gap in the market, but perhaps reworking it to try and breathe new life into it.
Because the problem isn't about rom-coms as a concept. I mean, what things could you enjoy watching more possibly in the universe than attractive people falling in love and laughing at jokes?
But
it's the fact that they got so dated and so cliche and formulaic.
And why does it always have to be attractive young people? Why can't it? You know, because let's face it,
I don't want to watch ugly people falling in love.
Exactly, it gets a bit depressing.
I'm not interested.
99% of the population do not look like this. The population is aging.
Yeah, but 99% of the population don't look like Marvel superheroes either, but there's an audience for that.
Yes, but it's kind of aspirational. You know you're not going to be Superman, but you can fall in love, meet your soul mate, you know, in a coffee shop.
I'm fairly sure I'm not going to fall in love with Scarlett Johansson, but I'd still be happy to watch that movie.
That's the thing, is that society, while rom-coms have been in, you know, cinematic hibernation, society has changed a lot. You know, the culture has changed even within the last couple of years. We've seen a lot of changes. And I think if rom-coms are going to come back, and I hope they do, because I absolutely love a rom-com, they've got to come back in a slightly different, more inclusive form.
Feminism's played a big part in it. It's not just the beautiful, dumb woman sort of sitting there waiting to be swept off her feet. And I think they need to rework it.
I think that very reason would mean that new rom-coms will have to tread a very careful line, actually, because quite a few of the sort of rom-com tropes of, you know, a man usually being rejected at the beginning and then engaging in what is basically stalking for the whole film and that being rewarded. I don't think that's going to fly nearly so.
The classic running after the plane in the final reel.
Yeah.
So like, chill out. She said no.
And I think we want new heroes, a new kind of hero. Like Hugh Grant this week was saying that he's now too old and ugly to play the leading man, and he was the king of rom-coms. I mean,
he's just too young
rom-com,
to be in the ones aimed at older people, isn't he?
But
he's fallen between two stools there. 20 years' time, he'll be in a rom-com with Julie Walters, surely.
But I do think there's
Bill Nye.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But you talk about Bill Nye, and yes, there are older. You know, there are rom-coms. And always have been rom-coms aimed at older people, you know. But it's often done in such a slightly condescending, aren't they cute, sexless way. And I think it's time for maybe more intelligent, mature love stories.
It does seem that when you're talking about older characters, they're allowed to fall in love, but they're not necessarily allowed to be sexual.
Oh, God, no.
Or if they are, it's comic rather than
we can only
serious.
laugh at it, you know. Once, you know, if it's not taught young flesh, then we only want to see it for the comedic value rather than the romantic.
And there's also, I suppose, in this new Netflix movie, okay, the two main characters are two young white people, but then the bosses are played by Lucy Liu and Taye Diggs. So, 10 years ago, I presume that probably would have been cast with two white bosses as well, but not now.
But is that still not a bit uncomfortable because you've got this sort of the younger the couple you're really meant to be rooting for are a young white couple, and then the slight meanies who I'm sure they'll have they'll turn out to have hearts of gold, but they're not the heroes.
But it shows an evolution there, doesn't it? That actually people are prepared for. I mean, obviously we're getting to a stage where, as you say, there'll be more feminism in romantic comedies. There'll obviously be more gay characters, and there'll be more people from different ethnicities, and that will change what those films are like.
But the thing is that what fundamentally needs to change is the structure of romantic comedies. So, it's what we were talking about earlier. There's quite a lot of stalking. There's quite a lot of infidelity that's kind of turned a blind eye to. If you watch those 90s rom-coms, it's like if someone else catches your eye, it's okay to cheat on your boyfriend just because he's Greg Kinnear or James Marsden, or it's just someone who conveys dullness. We're going to have to see a diversity of plots as well as a diversity of characters. I think we started to see it, if you think The Big Sick, I think that came out last year, that was kind of a rom-com in the sense that it had jokes in it and it was about a romance, but it was also about family dynamics and racial dynamics. And,
they're having to blur the boundaries more, aren't they?
Yeah.
I think the best or most extreme example of that, and a really good film, was Get Out, which started like a rom-com setup and then turned into really a sort of psychological horror film.
Okay. You're not going to say that Get Out is your favourite rom-com of all time, are you, Holden? Because that's the next question in my script.
Oh dear. Can you go to somebody else first?
No, I'm enjoying this.
Favourite rom-com.
You strike me as a Four Weddings man. I don't know why.
Do you know what? Actually, Four Weddings was a really early example of a positive portrayal of a gay couple.
Sort of, except one of them dies.
Well, true, and that is a trope of gay characters in film. And there was a big age gap, which some people didn't like, because that's also a bit of a cliche. But still, it was... For most of the film, you didn't know that they were gay. So it was an incidental part for most of the film. It then became an issue at the end. But it allowed a certain humanity, I think, and a depth character that hadn't been allowed before. So for that reason, yes, I will say Four Weddings and a Funeral is my favourite rom-com.
For that reason, I'm out.
In more ways than one.
Kari, what's your favourite romantic comedy of all time?
I do like As Good as It Gets.
Oh,
I
yes.
think it's not a condescending attitude. It's a very realistic, let's face it, for most of us, love is just as good as it gets, our relationships. I hope my partner's not listening to this.
Okay, and Rebecca?
I'm going to say The Philadelphia Story from 1940. Katharine Hepburn, Jimmy Stewart, Cary Grant. I love it so much that for my birthday I rented a cinema screening room and made 20 of my closest and most gullible friends come and watch it with me.
That's a classy choice. What a classy lady.
And almost an ancient history.
Getting back towards the Romans again.
A Roman rom-com is definitely missing.
I thought you were going to say Antony and Cleopatra or something.
I suppose you could include Roman Holiday, but I don't think it can. Anyway, none of you mentioned Annie Hall or Groundhog Day, so you're all wrong. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Rebecca Gillie, Holden Frith and Kari Wilkin. If you like the show, then please do take a moment, do it now, to rate us and review us and subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. It really helps. It helps other people find the show and discover us and listen, like you. And if you really do like the show, then come and see us live at the Cheltenham Science Festival on the evening of Thursday, the 7th of June. You can use the promo code THEWEEK to get 50% off the ticket price. For more from The Week, visit theweek.co.uk for our free email newsletter The Weekday, or you can get the magazine delivered direct to your door. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, I love you. I'm English, but I can say I love you. And goodbye.